In the Eastern Caribbean is a chain of islands, many of volcanic origin. Toward the northern end is the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, a two-island country that became independent in 1983. In this video, we will concentrate on the larger of the two islands, St. Kitts. For the many tourists who visit St. Kitts, the island is predominantly a wonderful combination of sand, sea, and sun. Here tourists walk the beach at North Frigate Bay, in an area now devoted to the construction of large hotels, casinos, and other tourist amenities. St. Kitts is one of the Caribbean's newer popular tourist destinations, and tourists appreciate its beautiful landscape, its relatively uncrowded conditions, and its friendly people. Here we have a glimpse of the rugged volcanic interior, and of the newer homes that dot the hillsides near the tourist area. Some of the homes have been built by the professionals and business people who have been benefiting from the modern St. Kitts economy. Others belong to Kittitians who have returned from living abroad. This map shows the Southeast Peninsula and the narrow neck of land between North and South Frigate Bay, where the tourists congregate. At the same time, we see that the tourist area is really only a small portion of this beautiful island. This is the view that now greets the many cruise ship passengers who visit Basseterre, the capital city of St. Kitts and Nevis. Passengers enter Basseterre through this imposing new gate at the end of the dock. If they look to the left, they see this view of the island's beautiful rugged interior. And along the edge of the mountains is a beautiful mantle of light green sugarcane. Basseterre is a beautiful former colonial town, and the building coming into view is the old treasury that used to form the entrance to the town.
All I have is 1 hour tour today, 1 hour, air conditioned.
Well, we just came off the tour.
Okay, darling.
As we view the town side of the old treasury, we hear a taxicab driver speaking with a cruise ship passenger. Nowadays, the old treasury building houses the St. Christopher Heritage Society, and across from it, the National Museum. The Heritage Society and the museum are very important for preserving and documenting the historical artifacts, island customs and traditions, music, historic sites, and the natural environment of St. Kitts. Here we see a mortar and pestle, archaeological remnants from the prehistoric Amerindian period. A major display concerns the story of sugar in St. Kitts. It describes the introduction of cane sugar from Brazil and many of the features of the resulting plantation system, including the importation of thousands of African slaves. The museum also features the colorful costumes from modern festivals, and prominently displayed on a nearby wall is the MacMahon map of 1828. This is one of the most remarkable historic maps of any Caribbean island. It displays every plantation, property boundary, and building in 1828, just 6 years before the emancipation of slaves. It is the Caribbean's most detailed visual record of the height of the sugar plantation era. Another display documents the construction of the railway and central sugar factory of St. Kitts beginning in 1910. By the early 20th century, St. Kitts' sugar industry was threatened by more efficient production in other locations. As a result, a large modern sugar factory was constructed near Basseterre, and a railway also constructed to connect it to all of the plantations in the island. Construction of the railway took from 1910 to 1926, and when it was completed, the new sugar factory was able to replace the dozens of inefficient small factories on individual plantation properties. Construction of the railway required hundreds of local workers, as well as a number of technical experts from Great Britain. The first section of track connected the seaport with the location of the new sugar mill. Gradually, other sections were completed so that the entire 30-mile track was finished by 1926. The railway is still in operation, and most recently, a modern tourist train has been added. Jackie Armony of the St. Christopher Heritage Society explains its importance.
It is a very interesting project and one that has been long in coming, but I think it definitely has enhanced the tourism product of this country. It allows people to really see our country, including us, citizens, local people, because when we go on that railway, when we have the opportunity to go on it, we see our country from a whole different perspective.
We are going to share that experience of seeing the country from a whole different perspective by taking a ride on the new tourist train. We will start at the station near the sugar factory and then proceed in a counterclockwise rotation around the entire island. Along the way, we will stop at a number of historical sites, including Otley's Plantation Inn, the Rollins Plantation, the Golden Lemon Inn, Brimstone Hill Fortress, Carabelle Batik on the old Romney Plantation, the Fairview Inn, and finally the town of Basseterre. We are waiting for the train at the small station that has been constructed for tourists. Nearby are the Scenic railway buses that are used to transport tourists from cruise ships and from hotels. The train is a bit of an engineering marvel. It's a full-sized, double-decker, air-conditioned vehicle. Yet it operates on a very narrow 30-inch gauge track. This narrow gauge has been adequate for the carts that carry cane from the plantations to the sugar factory, but putting a full-size modern vehicle on this narrow track has been a real challenge. Today, all passengers are starting their journey on the open upper deck. We begin by passing through the outskirts of Basseterre. Here we see some of the newer housing associated with the latest phase of Basseterre's development. As we leave town, we pass near the Caribbean Sea, and the rail line hugs the coast throughout its journey around the island. As we follow the route, we will return from time to time to the wonderful map produced in 1828 by William McMahon. It will serve as a constant reminder of conditions just before the emancipation of slaves. As we zoom in on this section of map, which focuses on the current location of the railway station, we see not only plantations and individual properties or fields, but also the settlements where slaves lived. Even their individual houses are recorded on the map. The document also shows us sugar factories and other industrial buildings. Our trip on the Scenic train takes us through a modern industrial area. Here, rock is crushed, and sand, gravel, and cement are mixed for the building needs of contemporary St. Kitts. Meanwhile, the train rattles through an area of small farms, where livestock rush from the sound of the train. The track is now very close to the sea, and throughout most of its journey it is also close to the major road that circles the island. This often provides us with splendid views of not only the countryside, but also of the small towns that dot the landscape. While sugarcane has been transported on the train since the early 20th century, other goods and people are transported by cars, trucks, and bus by road. Here we see the small scout that travels ahead of the tourist train to make sure that the track is clear. And here we pass under a small bridge that allows people to move from one side of the track to the other. The staff of the Scenic train do their best to keep the passengers happy and comfortable. The train operates by diesel-electric power, which means that there's lots of electricity to run this blender and to run the air conditioning in the deck below. So while the passengers have an unparalleled opportunity to travel through the heart of the St. Kitts landscape, they can do so in real comfort. Here we have our first close-up view of sugarcane. Sugar covers about a third of the island of St. Kitts, and it covers much of the arable land between the sea and the 1,000-foot contour. Remarkably, this basic pattern of land use has changed little in the last 350 years. If we had been able to take a trip like this at the time of the McMahon map, the landscape would look similar to what we see today. The slave villages have disappeared, although a few of them are now the sites of small towns. Many of the property and field boundaries remain intact. Some of the boundaries can even be tracked back to the 17th century, when the cultivation of sugarcane began. We're now passing one of the railway sidings that occur about every 2.5 miles along the track. Here, sugarcane is transferred from trucks into the cane cars, and at large junctions, engines are changed to take different segments of the train to the sugar factory. Here is a series of 18th century prints that illustrate how sugarcane was cultivated in the past. Cultivation was extremely labor-intensive, and here we see slaves hoeing the ground and planting the young cane stalks. Cane cultivation was almost like gardening. In the background, we see a wind-powered sugar mill, and here we see a cart pulled by oxen bringing cane to the mill. Slaves carried the cane to rollers, where a sugar juice was squeezed from the stalk. The juice traveled to the boiling house by gravity, and here it was boiled in a series of cauldrons. Impurities were skimmed off the surface, and the sugar was gradually concentrated as the fluid was moved from one cauldron to another. Experts would determine the exact moment to stop the boiling, and to pour the thick Muscovado sugar syrup into the hogsheads or barrels. Finally, the hogsheads were transported by small boats to the ships waiting offshore. Today's sugarcane looks much like that grown in the 18th century. Varieties have changed, and chemicals are now used to help fertilize the crop. Mechanization is also used to greatly reduce the need for human labor. Harvesting still requires a lot of laborers, however, and nowadays many of the workers are temporary migrants from Guyana or the Dominican Republic. As we pass through the cane fields, we see the remains of an old sugar factory. On the left is the hulk of an old wind-powered mill, and on the right is the chimney from an old steam plant built in the 19th century. And now we return to the McMahon map, where we are reminded of conditions just prior to emancipation in 1834. Some of the names of property owners are very familiar. Quite often, slaves took the names of their owners, and their modern descendants still bear the same names. In other cases, current property owners are the descendants of the original landowners. We see the name William Ottley in the middle of the McMahon map, and the Ottley property is now the location of the Ottley Plantation Inn. This prestigious, quiet inn is an excellent example of a plantation property transformed into a modern tourist facility. In various parts of the Caribbean, old plantation greathouses or mansions have been converted into hotels. Some tourists are prepared to pay a high premium for the privilege of staying in a location such as this. The atmosphere is quiet, informal, and relaxed. At the same time, it has a kind of elegance that relates, at least in part, to its historic past. The extensive property includes well-kept gardens, and one can find mature tropical trees that would not have survived in unprotected locations. Old plantation buildings have been converted into a swimming pool and into a restaurant. The designers have achieved a very pleasing blend between the past and the present. The fact that British royalty has stayed at the Ottley Plantation Inn further enhances its reputation among some guests. The atmosphere is in direct contrast to the high-density modern hotels of Frigate Bay, but it is a perfect location for those who can afford a quiet property carefully attuned to its past. Ottley's is one of the outstanding plantation hotels in the Caribbean region. We are looking at one of the 26 bridges of the St. Kitts Railway, and our scenic train is about to cross over it. The bridges cross deeply incised valleys that carry heavy rainfall from the mountain interior to the Caribbean Sea. Locally, the valleys are referred to as guts, usually spelled G-H-U-T. Some of the tourists have another fruit punch to celebrate the successful crossing of the bridge. And the tourists have obviously been enjoying the trip, partly due to the excellent commentary provided by the guide. Here we see the remains of another old sugar factory with the hulk of the windmill on the left and the chimney from the steam plant on the right. These pictures of a model of a wind-powered sugar mill from the nearby island of Nevis help to illustrate how the wind-powered sugar factory functioned. Sugar juice ground from the cane in the mill on the right traveled by gravity in a trough to the boiling house on the left. In the mill, we see the 3 vertical rollers, which are used to squeeze the sugar juice from the cane. Cane was carried up the steps, and then workers passed the cane back and forth through the rollers. Once the sugar juice reached the boiling house, it was boiled successively in a series of cauldrons. Once the impurities were removed, and the sugar was sufficiently concentrated, the resulting muscovado was poured into the hogsheads or barrels. Some, but not all, of the wind-powered mills were closed when steam power arrived in St. Kitts in the mid-19th century. Our modern train ride gives us an opportunity to see a great cross-section of life in St. Kitts. Many backyards face on the railway track, so we get to see a view of housing that we would miss from the main road. We cross another of the railway bridges, this time passing over the coastal highway. And on the other side we approach one of the major nodes and marshalling areas of the railway. The railway includes 700 of these cane carts and 19 engines like this one. Another 100 cars are used for transporting molasses and refined sugar. All of the equipment was manufactured in Great Britain. Here is one of the several crossings where road traffic has to wait for the train to pass over the highway. As the journey proceeds, the passengers are entertained by some of the train's crew. St. Kitts has a very strong church tradition, and some of the music we hear in the train clearly comes from that experience. Again, we have a view of some of the gardens and agricultural properties of people who live along the edge of the railway. Sheep, goats, and chickens are very popular livestock. As we look again at the fields of sugar cane, we wonder about the future of the sugar landscape of St. Kitts. The railway that was constructed in the early 20th century saved the sugar industry from extinction by making production more efficient. Now, almost a century later, the sugar industry is again threatened by more efficient production in other parts of the world. In recent years, the sugar industry has survived only because of preferential trade agreements and because of substantial subsidies by the government. Some have argued that the sugar landscape should be allowed to disappear, with other land uses taking its place. As our journey takes us to the northeast part of the island, we see in the distance the beautiful nearby island of St. Eustatius, popularly called Statia. And again on our left we see another of the many remnants of former sugar mills. And here we have a classic view of sugarcane on the lowland plain, with the mountainous interior shrouded with clouds in the background. Again, one wonders what would happen to this view and this landscape if sugarcane were ever to disappear. Government studies suggest that at least some of the land should be used for increased agricultural production. St. Kitts imports a lot of its food, and increased local food production could be used to greatly reduce that dependency on offshore sources. It has been suggested that some of the land between the 500 and 1,000 foot contour could be used for fruit tree production. Other areas might be used for growing vegetables or for raising livestock. There is a significant demand, for example, for better cuts of beef and for increased production of sheep and goats. Again, we are zooming in on the McMahon map of 1828, and we see another name coming into view, Joseph Rollins. Various members and descendants of the Rollins family have been plantation owners for centuries, and this cluster of buildings marks the location of the local Rollins Plantation. Nowadays, the site has been converted into a beautiful, quiet, and isolated hotel. The buildings and gardens are beautifully maintained. And looking outwards from the front of the old house, we have this beautiful view of St. Eustatius. And here we see that same view beautifully recorded in a painting by Kate Spencer, who maintains an artist studio at the Rollins Plantation. The first print is called Sugar Cane, and this, the second in a series of 3, is called Sugar Train. The 2 prints wonderfully capture the key elements of the St. Kitts landscape. The third print, Sugar Factory, depicts the interior of the modern sugar factory in Basseterre. The Rollins Plantation Inn is actually composed of a number of buildings scattered throughout the old plantation property. Both residential and industrial buildings from the old plantation have been converted for modern accommodation, and old architectural remnants form part of a very tasteful garden. This hulk of an old wind-powered sugar mill has been converted into tourist accommodation. Nowadays, guests enter through the same opening that used to be used for transporting sugarcane into the mill. A modern staircase takes guests upstairs to the honeymoon suite. The hammock outside contributes to the tranquility of the property. And this remnant of an old cattle-powered sugar mill reminds us of the property's industrial past. The swimming pool is comfortably nestled amongst the gardens and the old buildings. This fine old building has been converted into hotel rooms and an outdoor restaurant. And in the background we see the chimney from the old steam-powered sugar mill. The road leading from the front of the Rollins Plantation Inn is lined with mature sugarcane, looking much as it has for the past 350 years. We're now going to take a short side trip from the Rollins Plantation Inn. We're traveling to the small community of Dieppe Bay Town, a remnant of what was a substantial commercial area at the time of the McMahon map. The name depicted on the map is Dieppe Bay, which seems to be an anglicized version of Dieppe Bay. In the 17th and early 18th century, this was a French town, at a time when the French occupied the south and north ends of St. Kitts. One of the early warehouses has now been converted into the Golden Lemon Inn and Restaurant. In the early days, this warehouse might have been filled with hogsheads of Muscovado sugar. Today it's a quiet, elegant inn with a lovely restaurant. So we see once again how buildings constructed for the sugarcane industry of the past form an important core for the modern tourist industry. Sites like this cause us to think about changes in St. Kitts' past, and we wonder again what might happen in the future if the sugarcane industry were to completely disappear. Not far to the east of Dieppe Bay Town is an intriguing natural site called Black Rocks. This is a spot where, at some time in the distant past, a volcanic lava flow reached the sea. As we turn our eyes to the north, we see in the distance the nearby volcanic island of St. Eustatius. It reminds us that islands in this part of the Eastern Caribbean are still volcanically active from time to time. At Black Rocks, the lava flow congealed to form basalt, a dark rock that gives the area its name. The crashing waves make this a stunning natural sight. And now we return to our train journey and to the McMahon map. We're traveling west from the Rollins Plantation Inn, near the north coast of St. Kitts. To the north or right, we have a continual view of St. Eustatius. It's a member of the Federation of the Dutch West Indies, and it's been a Dutch island for most of the time since the 1630s. At one time, its capital, Oranjestad, was a booming trade center, even though trade with the French or British islands was illegal for much of the time. That illegality didn't stop a lot of trade with nearby islands, however. And now our train is passing by a school near the town of St. Paul's. School has just ended for the day, and the students in their uniforms are starting to make their way homewards. They are used to seeing the scenic train pass from time to time, and they don't seem to tire of trying to outrun the train. Students were given a ride on the scenic train shortly after it was introduced, and that no doubt piqued their interest. Maybe we have here a future Olympic champion from St. Kitts and Nevis. Our train has now turned southwards along the southwest coast of St. Kitts. We've left the upper deck of the train to visit the air-conditioned level below. Here we see the conductor keeping track of records from the journey. Although the lower level of the train is extremely comfortable, passengers tend to stay above so that they can see all of the scenery. We've just passed the important settlement of Sandy Point Town, and we are approaching one of the most important landmarks in the Eastern Caribbean, Brimstone Hill Fortress. This UNESCO World Heritage Site used to be one of the most important British military establishments in the Eastern Caribbean. Here we see it pictured in a colored drawing from the 18th century. We see the fortress from Dieppe Bay Town. And here we see people, probably slaves, walking the road that was the forerunner for today's modern highway. We see sugarcane growing in the fields, and we get a candid view of people's daily lives. Among the colonial buildings is the local Church of England, an important fixture in the West Indian colonies of Great Britain. And here we see a modern view of Brimstone Hill Fortress from the road below. This is a very large and imposing structure, occupying about 38 acres on top of an 800-foot-high mountain. Nowadays, the fortress is administered by the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park. It's a popular tourist destination, and today it's being visited by students from a local school. Construction began in 1690, and Britain continued to expand the facilities until 1794. The British garrison finally withdrew from the fortress in 1853. The site then deteriorated badly as wood and stone building materials were hauled away for other uses. Then in the 1960s, a local organization was formed to restore the fortress and to turn it into a museum. Now it is one of the most important and best managed heritage sites in the Caribbean. It's a complex site built over a number of levels serving a number of different military functions. It includes bastions, barracks, offices, storerooms, magazines, and workshops. These visitors are looking out over Sandy Point Town. And one of the first functions of the fortress was to protect Fort Charles below from invasion by the French. Brimstone Hill was almost impregnable as a fortress throughout its history. In 1782, a force of 8,000 men captured the fortress for France, but it was returned to England by treaty in 1783. We are now entering Fort George, the citadel at the top of Brimstone Hill Fortress. Nowadays, the various rooms off the parade ground form parts of the museum. The stone floor of the parade ground also forms an important catchment area for collecting rainwater. From the top of Brimstone Fortress, we see perhaps the best view of a sugarcane landscape anywhere in the Caribbean. For some, it represents a magnificent artifact going back 350 years. For others, it's a constant reminder of the slavery that made the plantation system possible. Now we're leaving Brimstone Hill Fortress on the next leg of our journey in the Scenic train. Brimstone Hill is so large, however, that it remains in view for several miles. As we continue to pass through the fields of sugarcane, we have a better idea of the great value that the British placed upon the crop in the past. The huge expense and energy of building and maintaining the fortress was justified by the very high value of the sugar production. The first British and French settlers who arrived in St. Christopher in the 1620s established small farms. They and their financial backers thought that they would all get rich by growing first tobacco and then cotton and indigo. This enterprise proved to be only moderately successful. Then, about 1650, the Dutch imported the plantation system for growing cane sugar from Brazil. Within a few years, much of the forest was cleared and the land was divided into large plantation properties. Here we see the name of Earl Romney on one of those properties. The Romney plantation was located near Old Road Town, the first permanent settlement established by the British settlers. The Europeans took land occupied by the native island Carib Amerindians, and today a small park commemorates the native Caribs. The focus of the park is a large volcanic boulder with petroglyphs, or rock carvings, made by native Amerindians centuries ago. The figure on the right side of the rock is a woman, and that on the left is a man. One of the reasons that the British and the French lived together in the island of St. Christopher in the early 17th century was to join forces in fighting off the island Caribs. They exterminated or drove them off within a few years of first settlement. At the nearby Romney property, we have a chance to visit the site of an old sugar factory. As we've seen from the train trip, sites like this dot the landscape of St. Kitts throughout the sugar-growing area. Here are the cauldrons in the old boiling house, just as we have seen in the historic prints and in the model shown earlier in the video. This mill was converted to steam power in the latter part of the 19th century, and here is a firebox and boiler used to make the steam. Nearby we see the remnants of a wonderful aqueduct used to bring water to the mill site. Water was important, both as a source of power and for the production process. Construction of mills like this required a lot of capital and also a lot of labor, both skilled and unskilled. A typical plantation of 200 acres would include one of these mills and about 200 slaves. The total value of the slaves, buildings, and equipment would be as much as the land in the plantation. This used to be a noisy industrial site. Now it's a quiet home for this sleepy donkey. Part of the Romney property is now the site for the Carabelle Batik factory and sales center. The old Romney plantation house has been destroyed, but this nearby building serves as a good location for the shop. Here skilled artists add colorful patterns to cotton cloth.
Keep some of the brown areas. So where the white is, that is where I add wax first, and that will stay white. So right now I'm on the second stage.
In the batik making process, patterns are created by dyeing cloth in a series of steps. Wax is applied to areas that should not be colored when the cloth is immersed in the dye. A different step is required as each new color is added. In the end, the colorful Caribbean patterns can be used to make wall hangings, dresses, scarves, or a number of other items. This is a thriving and important local industry, as tourists and locals alike have a high regard for the colorful fabric. For many years, St. Kitts has sought to diversify its economy so that it is not so totally dependent on tourism and on the sugar industry. Carabelle Batik is a real success story, illustrating how local manufacturing can be developed. And it has undertaken that development in one of the island's beautiful heritage sites. The Romney property is located along the edge of the area devoted to sugarcane production, and on the side of the property located near the mountainous interior, we have an example of native forest. This is the sort of vegetation that tends to dominate land use above the 1,000-foot contour. One finds a luxuriant tropical rainforest in the highest elevations of the mountains. Here, in a somewhat drier area, the forest is a bit more open, and some of the trees lose their leaves during the dry season. The adventurous can explore the mountainous interior along a series of trails. On our train trip, we've reached another siding, the location where cane is loaded onto the cane carts with cranes. There are two versions of the route taken by the Scenic train. The complete route all the way around the island, which we have taken, and a shorter route along the west coast, normally taken by cruise ship passengers. Since the train normally moves at a speed of about 8 miles per hour, the entire trip takes about 4 hours. This tends to be a bit long for cruise ship passengers who want to spend time shopping and doing other things during their one-day stay in St. Kitts. The shorter west coast route is ideal for them, and it gives them a chance to see many of the most interesting sights. Coming into view here is the Fairview Inn, another old plantation house that has been converted into a hotel. The building dates from the early 18th century, but it appears to have been expanded and modified at various times in the past. Most recently, in the mid-1960s, the decrepit plantation house was lovingly restored and converted into an inn. The verandas and ornamental detail contribute to the charming appearance of the building. The atmosphere is quiet and extremely relaxed. The facilities accommodate only a handful of guests, so there is never a sense of crowding. Moving inside, we can appreciate the simple design and decor from an earlier period. The main room in the house is now the dining room. And the hallway leads to the back of the inn, where guests can eat out of doors or enjoy the garden. The front of the property looks particularly beautiful in the glow of the sunset. And the gardens in the back of the property add further to the sense of peace and elegance. We've now reached the southern part of St. Kitts, the area referred to as Basseterre by the French in the 17th century. At that time, they occupied Capsterre in the north or windward side of the island, and Basseterre on the leeward side in the south. The British took over the entire island in 1713. As we approach the modern town of Basseterre, we see more and more new housing in its western outskirts. The street layout of the core of the town has changed little since the time of the MacMahon map in 1828. This early print illustrates the appearance of the townscape as seen from the harbor. Most of the buildings are different from the ones we see today, mainly because of a great fire in 1867 that wiped out much of the town. But the basic shape of the town and the mantle of light green sugar between the town and the mountains remain the same today. 12,000 out of St. Kitts' total population of 39,000 now live in Basseterre, so the town has expanded considerably since colonial times. The newly constructed Port Zante has replaced the old Treasury building as the entrance to the town from the harbor. Nowadays, about 200,000 cruise ship passengers per year sail into Basseterre. This is about double the number of tourists who stay over in hotels. St. Kitts has joined other Caribbean islands in attracting cruise ships by building deep draft port facilities. Cruise ship passengers do not add as much to the local economy as do stay-over tourists. And St. Kitts can accommodate stay-over tourists well with a modern new airport and an increasing number of hotels. But all tourists to St. Kitts have a wonderful opportunity to enjoy the landscape and the heritage of this island by visiting the museum, the Heritage Society, and by taking a trip on the Scenic train. Cruise ship passengers who leave the ship enter Basseterre through these gates at Port Zante. Many don't venture very far into the town and restrict their explorations to the duty-free shops near the ship. The stores tend to be the same as one finds in a number of cruise ship ports in the Eastern Caribbean. But those tourists who do venture into town can enjoy a setting that is quite different from any other. Those who take an excursion by taxi or train can experience a highlight of their trip. Basseterre is a busy place, particularly when a cruise ship is in port. But it is also very accessible, and one can easily take a good walking tour. Most of the architecture in the old town is Caribbean Victorian, dating from after the Great Fire of 1867. Besides visiting the museum, one can stop at galleries, unique shops, or enjoy a meal or cool drink. An important center of the town is the circus, with its Berkeley Memorial Clock Tower and drinking fountain. This is a good place to book a taxi excursion, or just to watch a mixture of local people and tourists. As the capital city of St. Kitts and Nevis, Basseterre contains almost all of the government offices. So the people we meet include a number of public servants, young professionals in business, and students attending the schools in Basseterre. There are always tourists, and today, with a cruise ship in port, there are a large number of them asking directions. It's easy to take an excursion into the back streets of Basseterre, and here we can see many blocks of finely restored colonial architecture. Basseterre is one of the most interesting, the most comfortable, and overall one of the most enjoyable towns in the Eastern Caribbean. And now we're back in the Scenic train just along the north edge of Basseterre. These modern satellite dishes stand in real contrast to the colonial architecture of downtown Basseterre. In many ways, St. Kitts combines many of the advantages of modern life, such as cable television, with the ability to protect its heritage. As we pass through the suburbs of Basseterre, and with a view of the island of Nevis in the background, we are approaching the terminus for the old sugar railway, the sugar factory. Today, it looks much as it did when it was constructed in 1912. It and the accompanying railway have allowed St. Kitts to remain competitive in sugar production for almost a century. But it's not clear how much longer it will remain in service. The golf course just behind the sugar factory illustrates how St. Kitts is changing. But the railway continues to play a vital role, and here we are passing through the main marshalling area for the cane carts. Within a week or so, in the latter part of February, harvesting of the sugarcane crop will begin, and when that happens, up to 900 carts of cane per day will be processed in the factory. Transporting that cane from all over the island will be a significant logistical accomplishment. Just beyond the marshalling area, we passed by St. Kitts's modern airport. And coming into view, we see the home base for the Scenic train. Our journey is about to end, and the passengers have had an exhilarating 4-hour trip. They've had a unique opportunity to view and appreciate the heritage of St. Kitts, to follow the track of the sugar train, and to be part of its new form as the St. Kitts Scenic Railway.